Vic, have you thought about MVP at all?
On March 23, 2026, following a 26-point, 15-rebound, 5-block performance, 21-year-old Victor Wembanyama sat down at the Spurs podium and was questioned about his current standing in the most valuable player race, and his response to that question completely disrupted the tranquility on which the NBA was built of. Before sitting down at that press conference and saying the things he said, he was considered an outsider, looking in on the MVP award. In the previous MVP rankings, he was behind 3 offensive juggernauts in Luka, SGA, and Nikola Jokic. See, Wemby's season was acknowledged as impressive, but at 21 with a whole lot of basketball and growth ahead of him, and his statistics flailing at a measly 24 points per game compared to, again, the offensive juggernauts that were his 3 competitors, he wasn't viewed as a serious contender for the MVP. Before the statements that Wembanyama made, he was firmly in 4th place behind those 3, very clearly considered a tier under them. 2 days later though, after the incident at the podium, Wembanyama had completely shifted and had made a sensational recovery from his 4th place spot all the way into 1st place. He had not only caught up to the whole trinity of SGA, Luka, and Jokic, but he had surpassed them to enter 1st place in the MVP rankings. The most insane part of this revival? He did it without dribbling a basketball. What happened? It's not really a secret at this point, but that post-game interview wasn't a regular post-game interview. The statements that Victor Wembanyama spoke into that microphone called out to the world and managed to single-handedly break down decades of internal bias that had pumped its way into the fabrics of NBA discourse.
Do you want to repeat the argument that we just had about why you feel like you should be MVP?
I mean, there's many reasons. But as I said, I think right now, it is still reasonable that there is a debate. But as I said, I want to make sure, my goal is to make sure that there's no debate anymore at the end of the season. But, so what, maybe ask a more precise question.
What would you say what are your 3 campaign speeches?
3 arguments? Yeah. My first one would be that defense is 50% of the game.
Wait, what did he say? In this interview, Victor Wembanyama highlighted defense as his primary argument for the MVP award, and that makes sense. Despite Wemby scoring only 24 points per game compared to his counterpart's massive scoring production, and despite him not being a primary playmaker for the San Antonio Spurs, Victor Wembanyama separated himself from his competitors through his ridiculous defensive prowess. Victor Wembanyama's defensive impact in 2026 has reached alien proportions, effectively leading the San Antonio Spurs' top 3 defensive unit. Averaging 3.1 blocks per game, he remains the most feared rim protector in the NBA. He's essentially glitching the league's source code. We're currently witnessing a 7'5" alien who treats the painted area like a restricted airspace where gravity doesn't apply to him. His 8-foot wingspan transcends the traditions of basketball and places him in a realm of an urban legend. His very presence fundamentally alters opponent behavior, as teams often abandon high percentage looks simply because he's within the vicinity. Statistically, the Spurs have been one of the best defenses in the NBA, and he currently holds a 98% implied probability to win the 2026 Defensive Player of the Year award. His combination of elite recovery speed and perimeter mobility makes him the true one-man zone that could switch onto guards while still protecting the paint at a historic rate. Even though he's indeed a step behind his MVP competitors in Luka, SGA, and Jokic by a wide margin offensively, his defensive prowess should close the gap between the 2 players, right? Shouldn't that be the logical option? Wemby is right. Defense is 50% of basketball. How did that not occur to the general public until now? Did it actually take Victor Wembanyama verbally stating it for MVP voters and the NBA media to realize it as a fact? Historically, the NBA hasn't valued defense. Across the entirety of the sports world, offense has been deemed the more entertaining product of the two. In the hierarchy of sports entertainment, scoring production has always seemed to be the protagonist, and in basketball, the hoop serves as a resolution of the battle between that and the antagonist. As humans, we are neurologically wired to prefer the proactive over the reactive. We want to see the creator succeed rather than the destroyer prevail. And naturally, we aren't paying to see what doesn't happen. Humans have naturally defaulted to offense as the most entertaining aspect of sports instead of defense. This is specifically why the NBA has leaned fully into the offensive revolution. From the introduction of the shot clock in 1954 to the freedom of movement era in the 2000s, the NBA has consistently treated defense as a necessary evil, a hurdle that must be lowered to ensure the real entertainment could happen. They have spent 75 years tweaking the rules to favor the offense, eliminating hand checking, the 3-second rule, and the spacing era. Why? Because offensive basketball has a form of pretty privilege. That neurological bias in our minds naturally makes an 83-80 slugfest ugly, while a 140-139 game is deemed more elegant. The league has favored that bias and has consistently adjusted throughout its history to favor offense. Is that why offense has been overvalued by media? The term defenses win championships is a long-standing ideal across the sports landscape. Coined by Paul Bear Bryant, it's a sports cliche suggesting that while offense generates excitement, defensive intensity is the critical factor in winning titles. It kind of touches on what we've been saying here too. The conversation of defensive play not being valued despite being equally, and according to Bear Bryant, more important than the glamorous higher-esteemed offensive side of the ball is a prevalent topic in sports. But is it true? If we tally every single NBA championship winning team from the league's inception to the present day, a timelining spanning across a variety of eras, styles, and trends that proliferated throughout the league, and then proceeded to average out their respective offensive and defensive ranks, we get a really interesting discovery that reveals the dynamic between each side of the ball and team success. Across the entire history of the NBA, the average offensive ranking for the championship winning team has been 5.3, on the cusp of being top 5. Cool. You probably will need an elite offense to win a championship. The average defensive ranking of the champions across the NBA's 70-plus year history is 4.1. In a league that has spent 80 years reinventing itself, the data remains obsessed with one constant: defense matters more. But no one seems to think that. If we look at the difference in perception between offense and defense across the NBA fanbase, the difference is astounding. I already mentioned this before, but the proactiveness that is required from all aspects of offensive play causes a deep-seated bias league-wide that tends to favor the valuation of the offensive side of the ball, despite historically defense being more valuable in terms of team success. But it's far worse than that. When considering individual players, this theme is even more severe. Offensive players get all the glory, the all-stars, the league MVPs, while defensive players don't really. You know what I mean? Imagine if the defensive caliber of play from individual players was held at the same regard as offensive ability. Karl Anthony Towns, who averaged 20 points per game, was awarded an all-star nomination. While as impressive and extremely talented as Cat is, Matisse Thybulle, who is essentially his inverse, a really good defender but bad offensively, would never sniff an all-star. Early in his career, he actually struggled to see playing time consistently. Trae Young, one of the most putrid defensive players, had been gifted all-stars, all-NBA teams, and for a short period of time was deemed part of the future of the NBA, solely because of his offensive expertise. His former teammate, Dyson Daniels, who was the best defender in the league last season, which by the way already outmatches Trae Young's peak offensive ranking, while also being a serviceable offensive player, which again by the way is leaps and bounds better than Trae Young has ever sniffed defensively, has never been considered in the same stratosphere as Young. There is a chasm in terms of the valuation of individual offensive and defensive prowess across the entire NBA landscape, from the media to the organizations and to the fan. And that individual gap is exactly what Victor Wembanyama is mentioning in this press conference. The exact one he pointed out and completely undone in the span of 3 days. Or did he? If you look at his other three competitors, Luka, Jokic, and SGA, they all are generational offensively. While Luka and Jokic are well below average on defense, and SGA is above average, Wemby is generational defensively while being all-star level offensively, meaning according to this metric, he outmatches his other three competitors. So yeah, that should end it, right? Problem solved. I mean, look at the screen. Logically, that valuation should be how merit in the NBA is measured, right? Oh my gosh. Before Wemby went on that podium, it was never perceived in that lens, but those statements shifted the entire deep-seated bias and propelled that valuation, for him at least, of defense to this right here. Here's the thing though, it was like that for a reason, right? I mentioned the gap in the offensive and defensive perception and how it proliferated across fans, the media, and the organization. Right? Fans and media are the outside perspective, consumers of the content, yada yada, usually don't really know what they're talking about. Yeah, but the organizations, GMs, coaches, owners, they're entrenched into the sport. Their goal is to improve their team. Their purpose is to figure out what sets their team up best for a championship. That aspect, the aspect of them having the same offensive bias, is a direct attack on Victor Wembanyama's statement. If Matisse Thybulle was as important as Trae Young, he would not be struggling to get minutes. If his defensive ability, which is proportional to Trae Young's offensive ability, was truly as important as said offensive ability, then the organizations in the NBA would have treated them the exact same. I'll repeat it again. If Matisse Thybulle's defensive prowess and lockdown ability, despite being poor offensively, was equally as important as Trae Young's prime offensive mastery, despite being ass defensively, then again, organizations within the NBA would have treated them the exact same way, because the results from that would have been the exact same. Matisse Thybulle not developing a jumper on the 76ers made him unplayable, regardless of how good defensively he was. While, despite Trae Young's horrific defensive ability, he was deemed the central figure to an entire franchise. Those determinations were made by the people trying to win games. The sole concept of franchises with their own best interests having that bias towards the offensive player proves that said bias exists for a reason, and the way that the NBA is operating post Wemby's statements are a bit flawed. But it's just not making sense though. Like, I feel like I'm going crazy. I mean, Wemby's initial point of defense being 50% of the game is correct, objectively. I mean, look at the research we did. I mean, in fact, according to said research, defense is more important than offense in terms of leading a team to a championship. So how does it make sense that the league in its entirety, teams that are specifically trying to win as many basketball games as possible, value these defensive-minded players universally across all time periods significantly less than they do for offensive ones? It falls down to proactive versus reactive. The same aspect of the game that imprinted the global bias towards offense and the fandom and the media is the same thing in basketball that shifts the importance towards offensive production. If you are a fantastic offensive player and you perform your job to absolute perfection, you're gonna end up with 2 points on the board. If you perform your job perfectly defensively, then somebody else can score. I think you guys kind of get it. Defense as a totality is 50% of the game, but individually, defenders are less successful. As an offensive player, if you play 100 perfect possessions, you're getting at least 200 points. If a defender in a 5v5 plays perfect defense 100 times, the offense can still score over 200 points. Teams' evolution in terms of screens, cuts, and motion climbs up their star player for the most favorable option. Teams revolve their offenses around matchup hunting and the exploitation of porous defense. Defense, especially in the 2026 NBA landscape, is the most team-oriented aspect of the game of basketball. Even if you have 4 world-class defenders, teams actively hunt that one weak link to take advantage of. That dynamic is the reason why an individual player never has and never will be more impactful when his skill set favors defense instead of offense, and why it's generally been deemed as a secondary skill. But Then you have Wemby. Even the role of the rim protector, which is essentially to stay near the basket and to be sure to eliminate all action that could possibly happen there, which is quintessential to having elite defense, is less valuable. Wemby, as a center, and as good of a blocking center as he is, goal is to erase the scoring opportunity the offense has. Even though that form is one of the most valuable aspects of defensive play, it's unable to carry a load like an offensive player could. Think of Rudy Gobert versus Luka Doncic. Proaction versus reaction enters the same limiting realm. Defensively, the best you could be is a cog, a part of a ridiculously important machine. But on offense, you could be the engine, the proponent to an almost equally as important machine. That's the difference. Listen, even though the NBA knows this fact, even though organizations have silently come to the agreement that is operated under this fact, even though decades of the NBA's every aspect of play has replicated this ideal, Victor Wembanyama was able to speak into a mic and completely alter the minds of the league. Here's the funny thing though. I don't think this will have a long-term impact. He isn't the first player to go to bat for the defensive side of the ball, and he won't be the last. But his words were more than enough to shift the perception of the league. For at least a moment. We won't see Dyson Daniels in the MVP combo next year, despite him being one of the best defenders in the league, like we see Luka Doncic in the conversation this year for being the best offensive players in the league. That's because MVP isn't specific to criteria or a set path of rules. It's a narrative award. And when the future face of the league makes a statement, brings attention to something, the remarkable historic things he's doing, sometimes the only way to acknowledge it is to shift your ideals around and paint the picture that will eventually be in his historic collage.